This is what we're going to cover today. I know that there are a number of people on this call that are interested in hearing about the merger between Ellis Hospital and Trinity, and I had added that to my presentation, but it is not here. And so I'm just going to have to switch presentations when I address that if we have time. But what we're going to go over this afternoon, and why is my video stopped? What is happening today, everyone? Okay, I'm back. I don't know what happened. We're going to talk about what care options exist for those who are terminally ill today in New York, what medical aid in dying is and where it is authorized, what New York's Medical Aid in Dying Act would do, what the benefits of this law are, who supports this option, and what you can do. And then, as I said, if we have time, I'll have to switch presentations and talk to you about the Ellis merger and what that means for end-of-life care, even beyond medical aid in dying. So hopefully we'll have time to do that. All right, today is posing many challenges. As Dawn said in the beginning, we are still in the middle of a COVID pandemic. And I want to start here because I feel like we have our communities, our families, our country, the world has experienced a tremendous amount of suffering, loss, and residual trauma. The masks are back on during this season. We're still losing about 300 people a day in this country to this virus. And I feel like when we talk about death and dying, I felt like it might be appropriate to just take a moment and acknowledge the moment that we're in. So this is just to say that I honor the suffering that we've all been through and the suffering to come. The coronavirus pandemic, if it did many things in terms of changing our dialogue, but I think it really showed people what a bad death looks like and highlighted what a good one might look like. A bad death is when you can't be with your loved ones, when you can't touch them, when you suffer. And we saw that happen far too often with this pandemic. So let's talk about what care options exist currently for people who are terminally ill. I want to start with a quote from Atul Gawande, who wrote an amazing book called Being Mortal. And if you haven't checked out this book and you are interested about larger issues around death and dying, I would encourage you to pick it up and read it. It's incredibly well written. But one of the things that Dr. Gawande said is that life is meaningful because it's a story, and in stories, endings matter. So let's talk about endings. If you talk to people about how they want their lives to end, you'll often hear people say that they want to die in their sleep, or they want to die without suffering, surrounded by the people that they love in their own homes. People have this image of lying on a clean bed in a clean room, surrounded by grandchildren, perhaps touching their bodies, telling them how much they meant in their lives, with a cool breeze blowing through the window. And this is not the end that most people are able to have. And in part, it's because of the way that we die. There are certain types of cancer diagnoses that really prevent people from having a peaceful death, even though there are options to alleviate pain and suffering at the end. But far too many people are dying in hospitals, in institutions, not in their own homes, and certainly not with the peace that they envisioned for themselves. So what are the options that people have under law here in New York? Of course, all of us have the ability to access all available medical treatments and interventions, limited only by our ability to pay, and that is no small thing. But without a restriction on resources, people are free to pursue experimental treatments, trials, and interventions up until the very end. Conversely, people also have the right to discontinue or refuse medical treatment at any time, and the courts have affirmed this right over and over again. When treatment options have ended, people also have access to palliative care, and we'll talk about defining what palliative care means in a moment, but palliative care includes the use of hospice services. When those things are not enough to alleviate pain and suffering, and there is a desire to hasten death, people have the ability to choose what is called VSED, or voluntarily stopping eating and drinking. And I'll define that in a moment. And we also have the right to access what is called palliative sedation, which I'll also define. Medical aid in dying is an option that we don't have in New York State, as we know from the title of this presentation, but it is an option for those in 11 jurisdictions across the country. And of course, we'll talk about that later. So let's define palliative care. I talked about it as an option for people at the end of their lives, but palliative care writ large is actually an option for people of any age at any stage of illness, whether that illness is curable, chronic, or life-threatening. Palliative care focuses on improving a patient's quality of life by managing pain and other distressing symptoms of a serious illness. And palliative care should be provided alongside other medical treatments. And as I was thinking about my husband struggling with a cold this morning and looking at the DayQuil and the NyQuil, it occurred to me that the best way to describe palliative care is by looking at a NyQuil bottle. It really is, NyQuil doesn't cure you of a cold or the flu. What it does is it eases the symptoms of that illness. And that is what palliative care does. It is not curative. It simply addresses the symptoms of any illness at any time. So NyQuil is actually a palliative care option. But palliative care is also provided to people at the end of their lives. And one type of palliative care is hospice. A few things about hospice. Hospice is not a place necessarily. It is a set of services. And those services can be provided in a patient's home, a hospice center, a hospital, a long-term care facility, or really anywhere that a patient calls home. Care is provided by a team of healthcare professionals, including physicians, nurses, social workers, pharmacists, chaplains, and other people who listen to the patient's goals of care and align those treatments with what's important to them. Hospice addresses far more than just physical needs. They also provide emotional, spiritual, and practical support, not just to the patient, but also to their families. A few things that I would note about hospice is that, while it's not a place, but a set of services, you can receive hospice care at a hospice center. Sometimes it's difficult to procure a bed in those centers, and eligibility really ranges for admission to those centers. So it may not be easy to access a hospice center. The other thing that hospice does not do is provide round-the-clock care for people. And I think that that is one thing that is disappointing to people who check out and then enroll in hospice, that generally speaking, when hospice is provided at home, it is the patient's family that provides the care, and hospice provides the support to the family to provide that care. So you may be getting a visit once a day or once a week from people at hospice, but it is certainly not round-the-clock care. And with hospice, you generally, in New York, need to have a year or less to live as a prognosis. And you also have to agree to stop curative treatments. That is not the case with palliative care. You can receive palliative care while pursuing curative treatments, but you cannot receive hospice care while pursuing curative treatments. So that is hospice. And when even the best hospice and palliative care do not relieve suffering, people have the option of asking for help in voluntarily stopping eating and drinking, and that is now called VSED. And VSED is a conscious decision to refuse foods and fluids of any kind, including artificial nutrition and/or hydration. The option can be chosen by a decisionally capable adult who has the physical ability to eat and drink, but consciously refuses foods and fluids in order to advance the time of their death. A determined and well-informed person with significant caregiving and hospice support can successfully choose this end-of-life option, but it is not easy. And there are far too many stories of people who watched their loved ones suffer indescribably at the end of life, even while using this option. I want to note that the US Supreme Court has affirmed the right of mentally capable individuals to refuse all medical therapies, including food and fluids. And so VSED has been sanctioned by the courts in every state in this country. When VSED is too difficult and someone is pursuing an option to hasten their lives in a state where medical aid in dying is not authorized, they have the option to ask for what's called palliative sedation. And palliative sedation is sometimes known as terminal sedation or continuous deep sedation. But in common parlance, it is really placing someone in a medical coma with the use of medications that induce decreased or non-awareness in order to relieve otherwise intractable suffering at the end of life. And so while it is uncommon, some patients who are undergoing aggressive palliative care still have severe suffering, either from the underlying disease, and pain medications have maybe stopped working or have become less effective, or they're experiencing intense side effects from those palliative care methods. And in these cases, when someone wants to stop their suffering and die more peacefully, they may ask their physician for the option of palliative sedation. It is really up to a doctor, sometimes an ethical board, sometimes hospital administrators, whether or not to grant the request for palliative sedation. And so just like with many areas of healthcare, you need to be an advocate for yourself or your loved one in order to have this kind of a death. The other thing about palliative sedation is that it is sometimes more an art than a science. If the doctor administers too much medication to induce this medical coma, they could bring about the stoppage of a heartbeat or breathing, and the person who is inevitably going to die may die too quickly, in which case the circumstances surrounding that death could be open to question. And so doctors are reluctant to prescribe too much, and in those cases, they may opt to prescribe too little, in which case someone may wake up from this sedation, confused, suffering, and wondering why they're still here. If palliative sedation is done at home, which is quite rare, but when it is done at home, that leaves the family, or even in an institution, it leaves the family scrambling, healthcare providers scrambling to up the pain medication, to up the sedation so that someone goes back into the coma. So it is not a magic solution at the end of life. And that's why, because none of these solutions are guaranteed to work for everyone, medical aid in dying is now an option that more and more people in this country are gaining access to. So what is medical aid in dying? What are we talking about? Medical aid in dying allows a mentally capable, terminally ill adult with a prognosis of 6 months or less to live to request and receive a prescription for medication that they can choose to take to bring about a peaceful death, so long as they're able to self-ingest that medication. That, quite simply, is what medical aid in dying is. And I know that that definition is packed, and we'll deconstruct parts of it and look at it as we seek to more deeply understand what medical aid in dying is. I did update this slide, but somehow my computer the update didn't stick. But 6 states have authorized medical aid in dying in the last 7 years. 1 in 5 adults now lives in a state where medical aid in dying is authorized. Oregon was the first state to authorize medical aid in dying by ballot initiative in 1994, and that state has now had medical aid in dying available to its residents for more than a quarter of a century. We recently sued Oregon. Why would we sue a state that has a medical aid in dying law? Well, we sued them because of their residency restriction. We believe that residency restrictions that are attached to these laws are unconstitutional, and we have lawsuits now in Oregon and Vermont. In Oregon, they have agreed to stop enforcing the residency restrictions so that people who are receiving care on the borders of that state can gain access to medical aid in dying. And we're waiting for a resolution in Vermont, and we're looking forward to New Jersey next. But we do believe that these residency requirements will be declared unconstitutional, and and they will no longer exist. New York's law does not have a residency requirement. I will say that it is exceedingly difficult for people who are dying to move to another state. It's possible, but it is difficult. It's really the people who are receiving care on the borders that will gain the benefit of these altered laws in the future. New York's Medical Aid in Dying Act was first introduced in 2015. It was sponsored by Senator Diane Savino in Staten Island and Assemblymember Amy Paulin in Westchester. It passed the Assembly Health Committee just once in May of 2016, and it has been sitting in both the Senate and the Assembly Health Committee for 7 long years. The current bill numbers don't matter because the bill will die at the end of this year and need to be reintroduced in January of 2023. But the number of bill sponsors is really incredible. We ended the legislative session in June with 72 bill sponsors, and the diversity of those sponsors is pretty remarkable. Folks from downstate, upstate, people from all different walks of life, very progressive Democrats, and mainstream Democrats, and people of all religions. No Republicans. I will tell you that many Republicans expressed behind closed doors their desire to see this bill pass because they themselves have witnessed suffering. They themselves may be facing serious illnesses, but there is an incredible discipline within that party. Sometimes I envy that discipline, but it has really prevented any Republicans from voting for or sponsoring these laws in the recent past. And so just like New Jersey, we found a lot of support among Republicans for this law, and certainly Republican voters support it, but not a single Republican voted for the bill in New Jersey. And although I have a goal of seeing Republicans vote for it in the legislature in New York, I would not be surprised if not a single one of them voted yes. New York's Medical Aid in Dying Act, the core eligibility requirements are the following. You must be an adult, 18 years of age or older, with a terminal illness that is defined by the bill as an illness that is incurable and irreversible. You have to have a prognosis of 6 months or less to live, and both of those things, the terminal illness and the prognosis, have to be confirmed by 2 doctors. You also have to be mentally capable of making your own healthcare decisions and acting voluntarily, and you need to be able to self-ingest the medication. The bill has more than a dozen safeguards, and these safeguards are modeled after those that exist in Oregon because the safeguards in Oregon have worked for more than 2 decades. There have been no cases of abuse or coercion or any adverse effects from these laws. The absence of evidence is sometimes difficult to hold, but the absence is actually profound in this case. And that is why every state that has authored and supported and authorized a medical aid in dying law has adopted these safeguards, including Montana, which adopted a medical aid in dying position through a court decision. So I'm going to highlight some of these safeguards for you. The first is that if either doctor has any concern about the patient's mental capacity for making the decision to request medical aid in dying, they have to make a referral to a mental health professional for an assessment. And no prescription can be written for this medication unless and until that mental health professional determines that the requesting patient has the mental capacity to make the decision. Also, the attending physician, once presented with this request, has to inform the requesting patient about all of their end-of-life care options, including hospice and pain and symptom management. And this is important because New York ranks second to last in this country in terms of access to appropriate hospice care. And this means that people are not being referred to hospice, not taking advantage of the benefits of hospice, and getting into hospice far too late to receive all of the benefits attendant to that service. The average time that people spend in hospice in New York about 72 hours. So again, people aren't being referred. And what we're finding is that in states that authorize medical aid in dying, people actually are being referred to hospice care. And we'll talk about how many people receiving hospice care are actually asking for medical aid in dying in states that authorize it in a few minutes. Another safeguard in this bill is that from start to finish, it is the patient and the patient alone making these decisions. From the initial request to actually taking the medication, it is the patient's decision alone. They're in the driver's seat and they can change their mind at any time during this process. Now, this means that some people will lose the ability to use medical aid in dying because they may lose the mental capacity or the ability to take a volitional act to administer the medication to themselves. But this is the safeguard that it's a trade-off between access and making sure that these decisions are voluntary and that no one is doing this to you. This is something that is very important for lawmakers to see in these laws, but we can definitely talk about this during the Q&A period. And another, and the last of the safeguards that I will highlight here today is the voluntariness of this bill. Oftentimes I talk to people who don't think that this is a proper moral choice for people. And what I say is that when this law passes, which I believe it inevitably will, nothing will change for people for whom medical aid in dying is not an acceptable option, because it is entirely voluntary for the patient, the physician, the health provider, the pharmacist, the hospice worker. None of them are required to participate in medical aid in dying. So who uses medical aid in dying? In fact, just a few people do. In New Jersey, about 45 people used the law in the first 2 years since it took effect in 2019. And actually less than 1% of those who die in authorized states actually use these laws. So we'll see the numbers tick up in New Jersey a little bit, but they will plateau to just under 1% because that's what we're seeing in states that have mature medical aid in dying laws, those that have existed for several decades. More than 85% of people who obtained a prescription for medical aid in dying were actually receiving hospice care at the time that they died. And so this notion that some people have that it is either or medical aid in dying or hospice or palliative care, it is actually a both and. Medical aid in dying is seen as just one tool in the toolbox of hospice and palliative care providers who present their patients with a comprehensive end-of-life care plan. Terminal cancer accounts for the vast majority of qualifying diagnoses in states where this is authorized, with neurodegenerative diseases like ALS and Huntington's disease following as the second leading diagnosis. And this is important because, as I mentioned, the requirement is that people have to ingest this medication on their own. And many people think that this leaves out ALS patients and people who are suffering with Huntington's disease. But in fact, many people with these diagnoses are able to avail themselves of medical aid in dying because doctors have devised a number of ways that people can self-ingest the medication by taking a volitional action that is more than just or different from taking a glass and raising it to your lips or drinking the medication through a straw. So I want to assure you that these conditions are not disqualifying factors for accessing medical aid in dying. We talked about how the research shows that the majority of people, when they think about their own deaths, would like to die at home. And with medical aid in dying, that option becomes more realizable. Nearly 90% of the people who used medical aid in dying in states where it's authorized were actually able to die at home. Interestingly, more than a third of these people, 36% of those who receive a prescription for medical aid in dying under these laws actually never end up using the prescription. A small number of them have lost the capacity, either the mental capacity or the physical capacity, to take that last volitional act. But more often than not, with this third of people, they simply live out the rest of their lives knowing that this is an option for them. Families have reported to us that their loved ones felt a tremendous sense of peace of mind, simply knowing that there was an option if their suffering became too great to bear, even if they never took the medication. I want to tell you a quick story about two phone calls that I received in February of last year. One was from Anne French, who was calling to thank me for helping to pass the law in New Jersey. She was overjoyed when she finally qualified for this option. And I remember that she said she wanted to do one last good thing with her life. And she wanted to share her story with others so that we could pass these laws in other states. Anne was a geography teacher and she understood the significance of borders. And so one day when she was taking a day trip with her husband after getting the prescription, she asked her husband to stop the car, and she got out in her scooter and she said, "I want to take a video for Corinne." And so he videoed Anne driving her scooter across the bridge. And this is a still from that video where she's looking across the river and saying, you know, it doesn't make any sense that me on one side of the river in New Jersey has this option while people on the other side do not. When she died, her husband sent us a text message that said, "Anne was at peace, and so was I. Thank you." I want to warn you that the next slide is somewhat graphic. So if you want to avert your eyes for a moment, if you're sensitive to these things, you should do that now. But the other phone call that I received in February of last year was from a young woman named Ayla Rain Eilert. Ayla was a 24-year-old ballerina in New York City, and she was calling me from her hospital room just across the border from New Jersey. And she was saying that she had undergone many surgeries to address the tongue cancer that she had developed. But instead of abating, instead of curing the cancer grew back more aggressively to 13 areas of her body. And you can see this picture of her shortly before she died, where the lesions from cancer were breaking through her neck and all over her body, really. And before she lost the ability to speak, because many parts of her tongue were increasingly removed, she told me that she had asked every healthcare provider for help in dying a more gentle death. And they even thought about moving to the family's home in New Jersey. The rest of her family lived in New Jersey. She herself lived in Manhattan. But no one thought that Ayla would live long enough to make it through the waiting period in New Jersey and establish residency soon enough to achieve the benefit of the medical aid in dying law. Sadly, Ayla was a strong young woman and lasted a lot longer than anyone thought she would, which was actually not a blessing. It was torture for the family as they rushed to try to keep her sedated. And she kept waking up and screaming in pain. When she could no longer speak, her parents would call me every few days from the hospital. They did receive home hospice care, but hospice gave up and asked them to readmit their daughter to the hospital because they could do nothing to control her pain. Ayla died within days of Anne French, and she died one of the most horrific deaths I have ever heard of. And it just feels incredibly unjust to have these two people separated by a zip code, a river, die such different deaths. Often I dedicate these talks to advocates who've worked with us to pass these laws, and I want to dedicate this talk to Ray. Ray Stark is a veteran, a Republican, and a resident of the North Country who is in hospice care today. He, like Anne, wanted to share and do something positive for the very last thing that he did. And he wanted to record a video for New York lawmakers, which he did. He is no longer able to speak. What he said before he lost the ability to speak is that the only time he's comfortable is when he's flat on his back in this hospice bed 24/7, as he says, waiting for the axe to fall. Ray deserves the option of medical aid in dying. He knew that by recording the video, he wouldn't move lawmakers to act in time for him, but he wants to make sure that no one suffers the way that he currently is in his hospice bed right outside of Tupper Lake, New York. So I just want to dedicate my talk today to Ray. Let me just talk about the benefits of the option of medical aid in dying, and then we'll stop and take a few questions here. Medical aid in dying honors patients' autonomy and protects the doctors who serve them. And there has not been a single substantiated incidence of abuse or coercion in nearly 50 years of combined data from all of the states that have authorized the option. Very few people choose it, but large numbers of people derive peace of mind simply knowing it's available. Adopting New York's Medical Aid in Dying Act will cost the state nothing, but the cost of inaction is high. Terminally ill people may not try the one last miracle treatment out of fear that treatment will be too painful. Many, too many, choose violent means to end their suffering rather than this compassionate option. Terminally ill people are being deprived of the peace of mind that comes with knowing they can end their suffering if it becomes too great. And as we've seen over and over and over again, far too many terminally ill people in New York will die suffering without this option. And families and doctors remain powerless with no legal way to respond to their pleas for help. There are a number of other benefits that are associated with implementing medical aid in dying laws. First and foremost, as I hinted at earlier, in states that have these laws, we've actually seen improved access to hospice and palliative care. Medical aid in dying laws, and even these discussions where in the lead up to passing laws where these issues are front and center and we're debating what end of life care should look like, this has led to improved conversations between doctors and their patients. And when people are having conversations with their doctors about the kind of care that they want to receive at the end of their lives, physicians seek out more training. And so they become better able to respond to the fears and the desires of their patients to avoid suffering at the end of their life by referring people to hospice, by delivering better palliative care, and then ultimately when these laws pass, by being able to really stop saying what we've heard from doctors for years, right? So when you're undergoing treatment for care and your curative treatments and doctors often say, there's nothing more I can do for you. Well, that is never true when medical aid and dying laws are in place, because there's never a moment where a doctor abandons a patient to inevitable suffering at the end. And so this has led to better physician training and better care all around. There is a tremendous amount of support for the option of medical aid in dying. The latest poll from Marist in October of 2021 shows that 59% of New York voters support this option and only 36% oppose it. This is true across the country. We've seen Gallup do poll after poll after poll. This is a result from Susquehanna polling. Gallup is much the same, but support for medical aid in dying really transcends political party, race, and age. There is a tremendous amount of support among civic organizations in New York. This is just one list of the organizations that support New York's Medical Aid in Dying Act. And I'll just point out a few here. The Secular Coalition of America New York chapter, the Statewide Senior Action Council, Now New York, Planned Parenthood, the New York State Public Health Association, and the New York State Academy of Family Physicians are among the many organizations that support this bill. New York physicians also support it. When physicians were asked by Medscape in 2018 here in New York whether they support giving terminally ill people this option, 56% said that they did. And then when they learned about the details of New York's Medical Aid in Dying Act, support grew to 67%. Interestingly, 63% of doctors want this option for themselves. And people of faith support it. You can see here the numbers. So, the vociferous opposition from Catholic leaders is completely out of step with people who are attending church services every week. And then also people living with disabilities. And the only polling that's ever been done of people living with disabilities, that polling showed that people living with disabilities support this option in the same degree and sometimes even more so than the general public. And I think I'm going to stop here. We can talk about what you can do, but I think I want to stop and answer questions and see if folks would like to. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if folks would like me to talk about religious refusals and the Ellis merger. So I'll stop here and see if we've got medical aid in dying or end of life options questions, and then we can sort of move to that other topic if you'd like.
Yeah, it would be great. Corinne, thank you. A very interesting presentation. I'm sorry about technical difficulties. I think you had them, I had them. I don't know what was going on. It's the snow. I had a question for you about the self-ingest provision.
Yes.
It reminded me of, I know it's a bad name in your quote unquote business, Dr. Kevorkian with his self-administered intravenous injection system to allow patients, once they were hooked up, to pull the switch to introduce something that would end their life. Since it's IV, is that fall into the self-ingest provision or not, or is it ruled out?
So the medication that's used for medical aid in dying is actually not an injection. It is a combination of medications that need to be taken very deliberately. Drugs that are taken an hour before the medical aid in dying prescription are to ease nausea and induce absorption of the drugs. And then it's basically a combination of medication that is ingested. That's why it's a specific term, ingestion, as opposed to injection. So yeah, this is not at all like what Dr. Kevorkian did. And it doesn't allow people to administer the medication to you. So there is a big distinction between what we saw with Dr. Kevorkian and what medical aid in dying allows.
Okay, thank you. I was just curious about that because it seemed like self-ingestion would be, even with intravenous system like he was using, it was still the patient that was doing the act, but it's the rule isn't that way. Okay, Robert Bosca had a question. Would it be useful to talk briefly about New York MOLE system for limiting medical interventions?
You mean the MOST form, the medical order for life treatment? So I do an entire presentation on advanced care planning. And while the MOST form is not an advanced care plan, it is a document that resides in your doctor's files that basically expresses your advanced wish, your wishes for planning should you be unable to voice what you want at the end of your life in terms of life-sustaining treatment. And so the most comes into play when you're unable to voice your own wishes, and it tells your doctor when and under what circumstances you want to either receive or remove life-sustaining treatment. So advanced care planning is very different. It's for planning when you're no longer able to voice your wishes. Medical aid in dying is for when you are still able to speak and voice what you'd like to happen. So I just want to make a distinction between those two.
Thank you. Robert Bosca had raised his hand. Bob, can you unmute yourself and ask your question or make your comment?
Yeah, it's my experience that even though there are times when docs don't want to withhold resuscitation because of the potential for family members suing, it's also something that I think people should stand up and do, is if there is a written order, and the most form is a doctor's order to not resuscitate, and that's in the hospital record, and the patient is resuscitated, they can be sued for assault. And there should be, I don't think there have been any suits as far as I'm aware, but there should be, because then they would think twice about resuscitating when somebody shouldn't be resuscitated. Because I've seen that happen a number of times. I was a hospital physician for a while. And I saw that happen a number of times. Another thing, see, I think also, because I did long-term care, worked in long-term care facilities, that and maybe you could comment on this, is there should be some potential sometime in the future for actually, again, would be a legal matter, that family members who keep somebody alive, just to suffer, they have, they're disabled, so they can't speak for themselves. So their family has the right to decide for them. But they are suffering on a daily basis. They're suffering. They can't get adequate medication. They're not approved of to do things that they might kill them, because, at least in one case, it was because the family wanted to keep getting the patient's check in the mail. So they keep them alive to suffer. And that again should be a crime. To me, it's just cruel. A number of cases like that, when people are disabled and can't decide for themselves and they're kept alive, it's cruelty.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Okay, thank you for that, Bob. Risa and Laird, could you unmute yourself, and you had a question or comment? Risa, you're still muted.
There we go. I have a very good friend who has a family member who ended his own life a couple of weeks ago quite violently with a gunshot. He was suffering from esophageal cancer. He could no longer talk or swallow or eat. And he felt, I guess, that was his only option. And it's very sad and very upsetting when his wife was accused of murder until they could ballistically prove he had killed himself, etc. This poor fellow was just suffering so terribly, and he would not have been able to ingest a medicine because he could no longer swallow. So will there be future legislation that will allow for injection, or someone else to administer a medication through an IV, something of that sort? I also want to add that my mother 27 years ago ended her own life voluntarily by simply ceasing a medical treatment. She was on kidney dialysis and opted to end her dialysis, and died very peacefully a few days later on hospice care with morphine in her system to help with any discomfort. My other question is, how is palliative sedation different from death? If you're permanently sedated and unconscious, how is that not the same as you might as well be dead? So a couple of questions. I'm really interested in the subject, and thank you, Corinne, for your very lucid presentation.
Well, thanks for those questions. And the one thing I will say is, I don't know what assembly or Senate district you live in, but if
Albany, I'm here in Albany, New York.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of people who may represent you in the assembly, and we can talk offline about this. But there are, most of the, actually, I'm thinking about the assembly and Senate members who represent this area, and there are very few that are signed on as bill sponsors, and it is absolutely shameful. They have been presented with the facts. We've spent time educating them. If you would be willing to share the story that you shared with me with one of them, that could make a huge difference. So please get in touch afterwards. I will say that you don't have to be able to swallow to self-ingest. And that is why a number of people with ALS and Huntington's have been able to use medical aid in dying. There are ways that doctors have devised that allow someone to take some decisional action to ingest the medication, but it doesn't have to be swallowed. So the person that you were talking about may not have been disqualified from using medical aid in dying. And no, there is not a move. I mean, despite the fact that opponents of this bill point to the slippery slope, you may hear that argument from opponents all the time about the slippery slope. Once we pass these laws, we'll soon be euthanizing people living with disabilities, is how the argument goes.
There was a letter in our local newspaper just this week from someone adamantly opposing medical aid in dying for that very reason. How, oh, well, the insurance companies will pressure people to die rather than to stay alive and need medical care, et cetera, et cetera. And that's nonsense. It's utter nonsense. There's no evidence that that has happened to anyone.
That's right. And what the reason I bring that up is because you asked whether there's a contemplation that these laws will be expanded to allow for injection. And the answer is no. That may disappoint some people, but it should provide comfort to opponents who fear this slippery slope, because it just hasn't happened. The core eligibility requirements of self-ingestion, mental capacity, volition, terminal illness, as opposed to just being dissatisfied with the quality of your life, all of those have remained core eligibility safeguards since the Oregon law has passed, and there has been no serious attempt to expand the laws. And as you brought up the the letter, I will also say that, you don't need a medical aid in dying law to see insurance companies denying people coverage for care. If any of you have medical insurance, you've likely appealed a decision where insurance companies try to deny you for everything.
Yeah.
So this notion that a medical aid in dying law will prompt insurance companies to begin denying coverage for care is absurd, given our lived experience of having to fight and scrap for the care that should be covered anyway. So it is nonsense, but I would say that your Albany-based lawmakers need to hear these stories, because they are shamefully not on this bill yet.
Can you give me their names?
Well, I don't know who represents you because of redistricting. Everybody's in a different district this year, but
Fahey and Tonko.
well, Tonko is your congressman. Neil Breslin is likely your senator. Neil Breslin, despite telling us that he would support this bill, has refused to put his name on the bill. Assemblymember John McDonald has refused to support this bill. Assemblymember Fahey has refused to put her name on this bill. These are just some of the Albany-based lawmakers that need to hear from you. So
Okay.
Thank you. Sherry had a question she'd like to ask. Sherry?
Yeah, I have a few points that I think are worth addressing. One is that I totally support this. And one of the questions I have has to do with the religious connection of St. Peter's and versus Albany Med and the philosophies, because they are a religious institution. I had heard that they actually counsel patients on the benefits of suffering. I don't know if that's hearsay or not. I think that there's an ideological disconnect. I don't know if the most is honored before their prime directive, if you will. And
about that, if we've got time, I'll leave it to the moderators if they want to give me an additional 15 to 20 minutes to talk about that. Yeah.
Yes.
and the other thing is, I had been involved with hospice, and I had lobbied for, compassionate choices at Albany. And it does cross lines as far as religious, not religious, cultural, ethnic. We have a few very active people here that support this. My question is also, if a person has an infection and refuses antibiotics, is that a fairly comfortable end of life?
I can't believe that I'm asked that question here, because a few years ago when I spoke with this group, someone in the audience talked about their mother, and maybe you're here today, I don't know, but I just want to thank whoever that was with the Albany Humanists who shared their mother's experience, who was diagnosed with dementia and actually had a rider on her living will that said that she didn't want any curative treatment for anything, and that death was quite peaceful and swift because no antibiotics were administered. And so it is an option for people, who've either put it in their advance directive that they don't want curative treatment, should they be unable to speak for themselves, or for someone who wants to hasten the end of their lives, they can refuse antibiotics. And there could be a fever that can be distressing for people, but after the initial part of the fever wanes, it's not a terrible death.
Yeah, I also would like to just share that if people are familiar with the MULS document, there are 3 portions on it. One is do everything to keep me alive. One is do nothing to keep me alive. And then this gray middle ground where with my mother, who's almost 96, does not want heroics, but was kind of slid into checking off the middle choice, which qualifies, quote, if there's a chance of recovery. I had a dear friend who had many comorbidities, and that was, she had a medical background, and that was what she had checked off. And what they did is they intubated, and she was suffering for 1 full week, unable to speak. So that middle ground is a slippery slope, I would say a dangerous one. And I would just advise people to be aware that that might not be the best choice if you don't want resuscitation, because it's so subjective, I think. And please feel free to respond to anything. And thanks for your great work.
Well, I would just say that the most is just one piece of a comprehensive end-of-life care plan that you can set forth as an advance directive. It is, as I mentioned earlier, it's not your form. It's a form that is owned by the doctor. I could do a whole other presentation on advanced care planning, and that includes making sure that you've designated the appropriate healthcare proxy, executed a living will that spells out in more detail what you want, and also have often frequent revisited conversations with your health proxy and people around you to make sure that they know your wishes. The most important thing to know is that that middle, as you call it, that gray middle, is very gray. And there are a lot of decisions that may need to be made. It's not as simple as disconnecting from support or stopping curative treatment. There are so many other decisions. And so, you know, talking to your health proxy and the people around you about what you value most at the end of life. Atul Gawande wrote in his book and in a New Yorker article about a woman who was caring for, who was the health proxy for her father. And her father was a very vibrant academic, very active in the outdoors. And when he was going in for surgery, the doctor was talking about the event, the kind of risks that he would face from certain interventions during that surgery. And after eating dinner with him, she got in the car, she went home. And as she's driving along the highway, she realized that she hadn't really talked to her dad about what he values about his life. So that when she's called upon to make decisions, when the doctor would come out of surgery, that she would know what to do. So she made a U-turn, went back, talked to her dad, and she was surprised to learn that he said, if I can eat chocolate ice cream and watch football, then it's worth it for me to undergo that risk. And she was stunned. She had no idea that that's what her dad valued at the end of his life. And so it's those kind of discussions, not, do I want to continue with dialysis, or do I want this or that? Because you can't really contemplate every eventuality. It really is about figuring out what values you hold.
Yeah. So which would be the ultimate, the healthcare proxy, the living will, which is the absolute most weighted one of all of those?
But the word of your health proxy, particularly if that person is a good advocate for you, is the most important thing. But a gift that you can give your health proxy is setting forth your wishes in writing. And so if there are specific things that you want and don't want, putting them in writing in a living will, having that living will notarized and keeping it on file, but not putting it in a file cabinet, sharing it with the health proxy and other people around you, maybe carrying a wallet card that shows people where your living will is really important. I like to think of advanced care plans as a gift, because they allow the health proxy, in the face of sometimes horrible family disagreements, to point to your own words and say, this is what she wanted. And that relieves the health proxy of some of the burden.
So the proxy is the most important, and then the most?
No, I would say the health proxy is the most important. And the next most important thing is to put your wishes in writing. The most, remember, is not your plan. It is a document that's kept on file in the doctor's office about life-sustaining treatment. There are a number of other medical questions and situations that arise that don't have to do with sustaining life, which is what the most is about. So the living will is a more comprehensive plan that sets forth what kind of care you want and don't want, should you be unable to speak for yourself. The most is just about whether you want life-sustaining treatment.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Corinne, I had another question here for you. Get back to choices. Eleanor asked, why isn't helium or nitrogen inhalation method discussed more widely? And a related question we had was from Sue, is how do you ingest if you can't swallow?
So I'll answer the second one first, and that is that there are methods where doctors can set up in the feeding tube and other types of administration, like rectal administration, where someone needs to just press a plunger or a button that allows for the ingestion of that medication. So it's not intravenous, as I mentioned, but through a feeding tube, through rectal administration. Those are just some of the ways that you can use medical aid in dying and not have to swallow.
Okay.
As for the first question, I personally don't talk about these other methods because that's not the way that Compassion and Choices. There's two reasons. One is at Compassion and Choices, we believe that the option to have a peaceful death and be the agent of your own death experience should be authorized by law. And the reason, and I share these values, is that one, if you take your life in some of these other ways that have been described by the other organizations, you could implicate family members if they know about it, if they're around, or if they're suspected of participating. Yes, these methods, there's descriptions about how to do it yourself, but people should not have to die alone, away from their families. No one should be in legal jeopardy for helping someone achieve a peaceful death. But for me, more importantly, the reason that I don't talk about these options is because I have traveled this state from the tip of the North Country to the tip of Long Island, from Buffalo to Brooklyn, and I have heard far too many stories of people who have tried to take their own lives in a variety of ways and had that effort fail miserably. They've ended up on life support. They've ended up with charges pending over their relatives' heads while, they were kept alive artificially in the hospital, knowing that if they died, their relatives would be charged. It's just been a horrible, you'd think we're in the midst of an opioid crisis and people are dying of drug overdose all the time. You'd think it would be quite easy. But when you have a terminal illness and you've been on pain medication for a very long time, taking your own life is not quite as simple as you might imagine. So no one should have to resort to an underground measure to do this. Dying alone, chance of failure, and putting their family members and their healthcare providers at risk. So that's why I don't talk about it.
Okay, thank you very much, Corinne. That pretty much the questions. A lot of people talked about, thought it was great, talked about things to do with carry your healthcare proxy with you, or make your most have it available so you know it's available. Sue made the comment, let's go back to all this advanced planning stuff is great, but let's go back to, I like her acronym MAID for medical aid in dying. And then she also, if you could share a little bit about the potential impacts of the Ellis Trinity Health merger on likely end of life care at Ellis or in Trinity facilities.
Yeah. Okay, we can definitely get back to medical aid in dying, and but let me share my screen again, and I'll talk to you about the merger a little bit.
I know there's several people here that have been concerned about that, and if you can share something, it would be great.
So I am part of a coalition. Oh man, I don't know why I keep trying to add these slides to my presentation and it's not working. Just give me 1 second.
That's okay. It's that kind of day.
Okay. So the reason that the merger between Ellis Community Hospital and Trinity is so concerning to people is because Catholic hospital systems like Trinity abide by what are called ethical and religious directives. And what I'd like to do is tell you what those directives are and what their impact on end-of-life care can be. So I'll just go through a few of these with you with you now. So ethical guidelines, the ethical and religious directives are adopted by the Catholic Church leadership, and they serve to guide the kind of care that healthcare institutions that are controlled by Catholics can deliver. So, you know, one of the most important directives, and there are a number of them, states, and this is directive number 24, in compliance with federal law, a Catholic healthcare institution will make available to patients information about their rights under the laws of their state to make an advance directive for their medical treatment. The institution, however, will not honor an advance directive that is contrary to Catholic teaching. If the advance directive conflicts with Catholic teaching, an explanation should be provided as to why the directive cannot be honored. And so in practice, this means that end-of-life preferences may not be respected because they're contrary to Catholic teaching. Okay. Another directive that governs what Catholic institutions can do is directive number 56, which says that a person has a moral obligation to use ordinary or proportionate means for preserving his or her life. And proportionate means are those that in the judgment of the patients offer a reasonable hope of benefit and do not entail an excessive burden or impose excessive expense on the family or the community. But the impact of directive number 24 on 56 is that preferences are negated by the phrase unless it is contrary to Catholic moral teaching. Again, there's a directive that deals with advanced care planning about a reasonable hope of benefit, that you can forego extraordinary or disproportionate means of preserving life, but that is limited by this provision about contrary to Catholic moral teaching. And then directive number 58 is about VSED, really. It's about the obligation to provide patients with food and water, including medically assisted nutrition and hydration for those who cannot take food orally. And this obligation extends to patients in chronic and presumably irreversible conditions who can reasonably be expected to live indefinitely if given such care. Medically assisted nutrition and hydration become morally optional when they can't reasonably be expected to prolong life or would be excessively burdensome. But Catholic healthcare institutions often point to Directive 58 when they refuse VSED, which is a request for voluntarily stopping eating and drinking. So a person with dementia, with years or life ahead, may put in their advance directive that they'd like to withhold nutrition and hydration, but with these ethical and religious directives, Catholic hospitals often refuse the request to do that. Again, Directive 59 is about free and informed judgment, and this is again, negated by the phrase contrary to Catholic moral teaching, and we've seen this happen in hospitals across the country. Directive number 60 is the one that is the most is the most impactful in terms of whether and when New York adopts a medical aid in dying law. The Catholic Church calls medical aid in dying euthanasia, even though euthanasia is defined as someone else taking an action to relieve someone of their suffering. So that is not medical aid in dying, but the Catholic Church calls medical aid in dying euthanasia and says that euthanasia is an act or a mission that by itself or by intention causes death in order to alleviate suffering. And Catholic healthcare institutions may never condone or participate in this, and that patients who request euthanasia should receive loving care, psychological and spiritual support, and appropriate remedies for pain and other symptoms so that they can live in dignity until the time of natural death. And I want to come back to what someone else asked about the difference between palliative sedation and medical aid in dying, because the Catholic Church does not oppose palliative sedation. And what they say is that there's a dual effect of palliative sedation. Too much sedation could actually result in someone dying. And in fact, that is what happens with palliative sedation. But so long as the intention is not to hasten death, Catholic healthcare providers are able to engage in palliative sedation. I can tell you that they do not. It is exceedingly rare that people can access palliative sedation in a Catholic healthcare institution. It does happen, but these decisions are made by people, and it is that, you know, there may be healthcare providers that understand the suffering that someone is going through. But I will say that part of the reason that people's advanced care plans are not honored are really directive number 61. And this, I think, is the most disturbing of all of them. And I'll read it in full. You can read it along with me here. But directive number 61 states that patients should be kept as free of pain as possible so that they may die comfortably and with dignity and in a place where they wish to die. Since a person has the right to prepare for his or her death while fully conscious, he or she should not be deprived of consciousness without a compelling reason. Medicines capable of alleviating or suppressing pain may be given to a dying person, even if this therapy may indirectly shorten a person's life, so long as the intent, as I said before, is not to hasten death. But here's what's so concerning. Patients experiencing suffering, as this directive states, that cannot be alleviated should be helped to appreciate the Christian understanding of redemptive suffering. And this directive applies to all patients, no matter if they are Christian or not. And what we're seeing with these hospital mergers is that people are left in communities like Schenectady without access to a secular hospital. And they are being treated by a hospital that is obliged to follow ethical and religious guidelines that tell the healthcare provider that if they are suffering, they should be helped to appreciate the Christian understanding of redemptive suffering. And I think that I don't really need to expand on that, but I will say that a woman with advanced breast cancer, battling her disease for more than 20 years of surgery, chemotherapy, radiation, now in the terminal phase, she may seek palliative sedation, but may be denied if her reasons are not deemed compelling, and she would be counseled about the redemptive nature of suffering. So I will leave it there. In terms of Ellis Hospital, I am part of a coalition, some of you may be as well, that is fighting this merger, but it does look like the merger is going to happen. Patients will be left with trying to find their way to Albany Medical Center for treatment. There is a bill pending in the legislature called the Hospital Transparency Act that would require Catholic institutions and other institutions that have what they call policy-based exclusions for care to make those exclusions known on a website maintained by the Department of Health. But that simply, puts the burden on patients to do research about their healthcare institutions on this website maintained by DOH instead of, so that they know what kind of care they can receive and not at different healthcare institutions. And how often do you run to a website to check what kind of care a hospital will deliver to you before going to the hospital in an emergency? So it is quite problematic, and I'll leave it there.
Okay, well, thank you much for that. Sorry to ask you for a little bit more, but issue some of us are concerned about. Risa and Laird had a question and comment. Shouldn't the phrase "in the patient's judgment" take precedence? Why do dogs get better end-of-life care than humans?
Yeah, I mean, not only do dogs get better care than humans, but if you would stand by and watch dogs suffer, you may be charged with animal cruelty. But I will say that while this argument resonates so well with supporters of medical aid in dying and with those of us that have pets and have watched them suffer and then be relieved of that suffering, it backfires when you speak about this publicly and with opponents, because basically what they say is that people aren't the same as animals. Now, it's true. And also medical aid in dying isn't the same as putting your pet down, because you're basically giving power to people to make decisions about their own lives. And by not allowing medical aid in dying, you're taking that agency away from people. But this argument about pets certainly resonates with supporters.
So Sherry had a question about back to MOLST proxies and living will. Does the date on the document supersede other documents, or are they mutually enforced?
The date supersedes, and people should be encouraged to renew that MOLST and have the
Okay.
document. Now, remember, the MOLST is owned by the doctor. So it is, you have to make an affirmative request to have that doctor destroy the previous one. The advanced care directives, the living will, the health proxy, those are things that are in your possession.
And Sherry also had a question. How can you pass along to us any activities we can do to support this cause besides camping out on the our assembly person's doorstep or things like that?
Well, I can. I'm going to refer you to our website. I'm going to type it in the chat box right now. This is the website where you can go and take action. I will say that we're in kind of a no man's land right now between the election and when lawmakers take office. And so there is no way to contact newly elected officials. You know, Assemblymember McDonald has the same contact information, Pat Fahey, Senator Breslin, but for newly elected people, they don't have websites or mailing addresses yet. And so I think folks in the Capital Region should be pretty well you know what? The districts are different. That's the problem. Anyway, let me tell you, this is the best way to get involved now. Email me. I will look up your address and tell you exactly who represents you. This is my email address here if you want to get more involved. I will say that we've got a huge slate of activities planned for the Capital Region starting January 9th. Lawmakers return to Albany on January 9th, and we're asking people to come to Albany and demonstrate. 30,000 pieces of legislation are introduced into the New York State Legislature every session, and only a few of those bills get picked up, debated, and passed. This medical aid in dying, making sure that people have a peaceful death, isn't a priority for anyone until it is, until you yourself or a loved one are facing down an inevitable death with suffering ahead. And so we need to let lawmakers know that it's not just polling numbers. It's not just that the vast majority of New Yorkers and doctors are in favor of this option. We want them to make this a priority. And so if this is a priority for you, I encourage you to join our efforts. Join us in Albany on January 9th. We're also having a huge lobby day on January 17th in Albany. We're doing a winter tour, as I mentioned, and that winter tour will circle back to the Capital Region on January 9th, and there's going to be programming around the Ellis merger, about medical aid in dying all that week. And so if you sign up for our mailing list, we will share that information with you, and I can send you know, folks from this group the slate of activities that we're going to be engaging in Albany and the Capital Region the week of January 9th. So those are some of the ways that you can get involved.
Great. Thank you for sharing. I don't see any other questions in the chat, or nobody's got their hand raised. Corinne, I know we've kept you a little longer than we talked about initially, but I do appreciate it. Very interesting discussion. Lots to think about, some good ideas.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. And please, you know, get in touch with me by email if you have any additional questions or you want to be looped in more closely to our efforts here, either that or on the Ellis merger. So thank you, and have a wonderful rest of your weekend.
Thank you much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.